On a storm-lashed night, a wounded stranger crashes into a lonely nurse's home, bleeding, dangerous, and hiding a secret that could burn her world to ashes. She heals him with trembling hands, never knowing she has just bound herself to Rafael De Luca, the most feared mafia boss alive. But when desire sparks in the shadows of blood and betrayal, Ilara's tender touch awakens a fire in a man built for violence. And as empires close in, bullets fly, and love is carved from ruin, one question cuts deeper than any blade. Can passion survive in a world where every vow is written in blood? Or will their love story end in gunfire and tears? Now sit back, relax, and step into a storm of blood, passion, and secrets, where a single touch can ignite desire and a single bullet can shatter love. The storm raged outside like a beast unchained, the wind clawing against the old wooden panels of Ilara's isolated house, rain hammering on the roof in furious rhythm, lightning tearing the night sky in half every few seconds, each strike illuminating the silence of her lonely existence. She had just placed her worn stethoscope on the table after a long day at the small clinic in town, her brown skin still glistening faintly with the sweat of exhaustion, her almond-shaped eyes heavy with drowsiness. When she heard it, the sharp crack of branches breaking, the unmistakable sound of boots crunching against wet earth, and then a thunderous crash that jolted her upright. For a heartbeat she froze, her breath locked in her chest, her heart thudding against her ribs with violent force, her mind screaming that no one ever came this far into the woods at night, no one ever knocked, no one ever intruded, because no one knew she was here. Yet before she could move, before she could decide whether to bolt the door or hide, the world itself seemed to burst apart as her front door slammed open with terrifying force, banging against the wall as if struck by the fury of the storm itself, and a figure staggered into the dim yellow light of her small living room. He was a man carved out of shadows and danger, tall and broad, his black leather jacket torn across the shoulder, the fabric glistening with blood that streamed down his side, his blue jeans soaked and heavy, each step leaving crimson prints on her faded wooden floor. His face, even half hidden under the wet strands of his dark hair, carried a beauty so sharp it could wound, but it was twisted now in pain. His jaw clenched, his breath ragged, his fists curling as though sheer will alone was keeping him from collapsing. Ilara's scream caught in her throat. Fear froze her where she stood. She wanted to run, wanted to slam the door and pray the storm swallowed him whole. But something deeper held her still. The training etched into her bones as a nurse, the oath she had taken to preserve life, no matter the cost. Her trembling hands rose instinctively, even as her voice came out broken, no louder than the storm outside. "Who are you? What do you want?" But the stranger's only answer was a stumble forward, his knees buckling, his body swaying like a tower about to crumble, and before she knew it, he collapsed against her small couch, blood smearing across the faded fabric like ink spilling over paper. Ilara's chest tightened as panic warred with duty, the scent of iron filling the air, sharp and suffocating, mixing with the damp earth and rain that clung to his clothes. She stepped closer, her heart pounding, her hands shaking violently. "You need help," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking too loud might provoke him. She didn't yet know that the man bleeding before her was Rafael De Luca, the name whispered in the underworld like a curse, the mafia boss feared across continents, a man who ruled empires built on blood and fire. To her, he was only a stranger on the brink of death. Still, her instinct to heal overcame the primal fear gnawing at her spine. She grabbed the medical kit she always kept ready, an old scratched box filled with bandages, antiseptic, and tools of her trade, and knelt beside him, her knees pressing into the rough carpet, her hands hovering above his body, unsure if she was saving a man or aiding a monster. "Lie down. I'll stop the bleeding," she finally managed, her voice steadier now, though her hands trembled as they reached for his torn jacket. But before she could touch him, his eyes snapped open and she froze, trapped in the blaze of his gaze. They were the kind of eyes that didn't simply look at you. They invaded, stripped away layers, devoured secrets you didn't even know you had. Piercing, dark, and laced with an intensity that felt both magnetic and lethal, they pinned her in place, making her forget to breathe, making her wonder if she had just invited death into her home. For a long, unbearable moment, neither of them spoke, the storm raging outside, the only witness to the silent war of fear and curiosity burning between them. Then, with a voice low and rough, yet carrying a strange authority even in his weakness, he rasped, "Don't move!" Her chest heaved as his words wrapped around her, both a warning and a plea, and she realized her wrist was caught in his grip, iron strong despite the blood loss, his fingers locked around her delicate skin with possessive force, heat searing through her veins from the touch. "Please," she whispered, the fear in her voice softening into something she didn't understand herself. "You'll die if I don't treat you." His lips curved, not into a smile, but something darker, a shadow of mockery at her concern. Yet in the depths of his gaze flickered something raw, something vulnerable that contradicted the ruthless aura that clung to him. He slowly released her wrist, his head tilting back against the couch, as though even that small act had drained what strength remained. Ilara exhaled shakily, her pulse racing as she carefully slid the jacket from his shoulders, the leather heavy with rain and blood. She bit back a gasp at the sight of the wounds, deep gashes cut across his chest and side, angry and jagged, as though he had been torn apart by steel and fire. The blood kept flowing, stubborn and relentless, and for a moment fear gripped her that she was too late, that nothing she did could pull him back. But she shook the thought away, clinging to her duty, to her oath, to the fragile thread of determination that had kept her alive in her lonely world. With swift movements, she pressed gauze against his wounds, her small hands trembling but firm, the softness of her touch a startling contrast to the brutality carved into his body. As she worked, her senses betrayed her. His scent, leather, rain, smoke, and something unmistakably male wrapped around her, invading her lungs, pulling her closer in ways that terrified her. Every brush of her fingers against his skin sent jolts through her nerves. Every shallow breath he took against her cheek felt intimate, dangerous. And when she dared to glance at him again, she found his eyes fixed on her, not glazed with pain, but sharp with something else entirely, something that made her chest tighten and her lips part in silence. Desire. Hunger, a storm darker than the one outside, locked inside him and now reaching for her. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her pulse wild, yet she couldn't look away. The world outside faded, the thunder, the rain, the loneliness, all of it drowned beneath the weight of his gaze. For the first time in years, Rafael De Luca felt something other than the constant ache of violence and betrayal. He felt the warmth of another soul, unafraid to touch him, a softness he hadn't known since before the blood, before the empire, before he had become the devil men whispered about. And in that fragile moment, he let himself feel it. Then, without warning, his hand shot up again, gripping her wrist tightly, pulling her closer until she was nearly pressed against his chest, her breath stolen, her body trembling not from fear, but from something far more dangerous, far more consuming. His lips brushed against her ear, his voice a low growl that sent shivers down her spine, laced with both threat and promise as he whispered, "Don't leave me, or you'll regret it." The night dragged on like a fevered dream, the storm outside raging as though the heavens themselves were bearing witness to the impossible scene unfolding within the lonely walls of Ilara's house. She knelt beside Raphael's broken body, her trembling hands working tirelessly, cloths soaked in crimson, antiseptic stinging her nostrils, her every breath shallow and rapid. But still she refused to stop, refused to let the blood claim him, refused to surrender the stranger whose presence terrified her and yet pulled her closer with invisible chains, as though her soul had been waiting all along for this collision of fate. His chest rose and fell in jagged rhythms, every exhale harsh and ragged, the sound cutting through the silence louder than the thunder rolling outside. And as she pressed a fresh bandage against his side, she felt the tremor of his muscles beneath her palms, solid, burning, alive, and though he was drenched in blood and weakness, there was something untamed radiating from him, a power that not even death seemed capable of dimming. Her heart fluttered violently when she caught his gaze again, eyes dark as the midnight storm, but laced now with something heavier, something that made her chest tighten and her lips part soundlessly. It wasn't the glare of a wounded beast anymore, but the stare of a man whose hunger had been awoken by her touch, whose defenses, carved by years of violence and cruelty, were crumbling against the gentleness of her presence. She tried to focus on the wounds, on the clinical motions drilled into her training, the cleaning, the stitching, the pressure applied with practiced care. But the air around them shifted, thickened, became something else entirely, charged with heat that had nothing to do with fever or blood loss. The scent of rain clung to his clothes, but beneath it she smelled leather, smoke, and something raw and intoxicatingly male, and it tangled with the faint fragrance of her own skin, her own body warmed by adrenaline, creating an invisible fire that drew them closer with each breath. Her fingers brushed against his chest as she adjusted the bandages, and though she told herself it was an accident, a necessary act, the shiver that shot down her spine betrayed her, the gasp that escaped her lips exposing what she refused to admit aloud, that she was no longer merely healing him, she was being undone by him. Raphael's lips curved faintly, not in amusement, but in a kind of recognition, as though he could read every secret racing through her mind, as though he had seen this moment long before she had dared to imagine it. His hand moved with sudden purpose, catching hers as it hovered above his heart, his grip firm but not brutal, his thumb grazing her skin in a way that made her breath catch and her knees weaken, and before she could snatch it away, he lifted her hand, slow and deliberate, until his lips brushed against the back of it, in a kiss so fleeting, so delicate, it was more dangerous than violence, because it wasn't meant to wound her flesh, but to claim something far deeper. Ilara's gasp trembled in the still air, her instinct screaming to pull back, to flee, to remember that this man was a stranger bleeding on her couch, a storm of violence she could not control, but her body betrayed her, frozen in the gravity of his touch, her heart hammering in wild surrender to a rhythm she did not understand. The silence between them stretched, heavy, broken only by the roar of rain on the roof and the thunder shaking the earth. And within that silence she realized she had crossed a line from which there was no return. Her fear was still there, sharp and suffocating, but beneath it something deeper surged, something ancient and undeniable, a pull toward the very man she should have despised, the man whose very existence spelled ruin. Raphael's breathing slowed, his eyes never leaving hers, and in that endless stare he let her see what no one else had ever been allowed to glimpse. The loneliness buried under his ruthlessness, the need hidden beneath his armor, the longing of a man who had never been touched with anything but violence and betrayal, now undone by the simple, trembling care of a woman who didn't yet know who he truly was. Their breaths mingled, their worlds colliding in the charged space between their lips, and when he leaned closer, his face inches from hers, she didn't move away, didn't protest, because the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside her, and when his mouth finally found hers, the kiss was not gentle, not sweet, but raw and consuming, a desperate clash of fire and surrender that burned away fear and reason alike. Against all logic, against every warning screaming inside her, Ilara let herself drown in him, her fingers tangling in his damp hair, her body pressed against the heat of his, the taste of blood and rain and forbidden hunger igniting something she had never felt before. That night became a blur of passion, of whispered gasps and fevered touches, of two souls who should have been enemies binding themselves in a way neither of them could undo, a night where healing turned into fire, where fear became desire, where loneliness transformed into dangerous intimacy. And as the storm finally began to fade outside, as dawn threatened to creep across the horizon, exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into uneasy sleep at his side, her heart still racing, her body still trembling from the fire that had consumed her. But peace was not theirs to keep, not even for a morning, because when Ilara's eyes fluttered open at the first weak light of day, the air itself seemed to vibrate with menace, and she stumbled to her window only to feel her blood run cold. 5 sleek jets cut across the sky like predators circling prey, and below them the earth swarmed with shadows of men, over 100 armed soldiers encircling her small, fragile home, their black-clad figures moving with ruthless precision, their presence screaming of a world she had never wanted to see. And in that single shattering heartbeat, she understood. The stranger she had healed, the man she had surrendered to in the storm, was not just danger. He was the storm itself, and it had come to claim her life. The morning light seeped reluctantly through the curtains, cold and pale, washing the room in a glow that did nothing to soften the weight of dread pressing against Ilara's chest. The world outside was surrounded by shadows of men and war machines, and yet inside the house, the silence between her and Raphael felt louder than the storm of footsteps encircling her fragile life. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her chest, her breath shallow, eyes fixed on the man who only hours ago had been broken and helpless, clinging to her for life, a stranger bleeding on her couch. But now he stood tall, the strength returned to his broad frame, his presence filling the room like fire and ice. His leather jacket replaced, but his aura unchanged, sharper, darker, colder than she had dared to imagine. Panic clawed at her throat, questions spilling from her lips before she could restrain them, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Who are you really? Why are there men outside? Why does it feel like I've let a devil into my home?" Raphael's jaw clenched, his silence more terrifying than an answer, his gaze steady and unflinching, as if he were calculating whether she deserved the truth or if it was safer to leave her in the dark. But Ilara pressed harder, desperation breaking through her fear, her brown eyes glistening with unshed tears, as her voice cracked. "Tell me, Raphael, I need to know. What have you dragged into my life?" For a long, cruel heartbeat, he said nothing, his expression unreadable. But then, with a cold finality that sent shivers down her spine, he exhaled the truth like a sentence. "I am Raphael de Luca," he said, his tone low, steady, merciless. "The mafia boss you whisper about. The man empires fear. The man who kills to breathe." The words hit her like a blade to the chest, cutting through her fragile hopes, and her knees buckled beneath her, forcing her to the floor, her trembling hands pressed against the wooden boards, as if the ground itself might steady her spinning world. Tears slipped down her cheeks unbidden, her heart cracking under the weight of betrayal, and when she finally lifted her gaze to him, her voice broke into 1,000 shards of pain. "So last night meant nothing to you?" Her words trembled in the air, fragile and raw, clinging to the faint hope that he would deny it, that he would take her hands and swear it was more. But Raphael only hardened before her, his face a mask carved of stone, his jaw tight, his eyes shuttered. He stepped closer, towering over her, his shadow falling across her crumpled form, and his voice lashed through the silence with brutal precision. "You were just a nurse, nothing more." The lie cut deeper than any wound she had ever treated, shattering the fragile thread that had bound her heart to his, and a sob ripped through her chest as she crumpled further, her fingers digging into the floor as though she could claw away the agony. He turned to leave, his strides heavy, final, but at the last moment his hand brushed against hers, a fleeting touch that betrayed the truth. His mouth refused to speak, his fingers lingering a heartbeat too long, his pulse racing beneath the mask of indifference. Ilara's breath hitched at the betrayal of his own body, at the war raging silently in his eyes when he dared to look back at her, and she realized that behind the cold armor of the mafia boss, the man she had seen in the storm still burned. Her lips trembled as she whispered his name, but he forced himself to break away, his back rigid, his silence a wall she could not climb. And yet, as he reached the door, her anguish erupted, no longer containable, her voice splitting the fragile air like lightning. "I love you, Raphael," she screamed, her confession tearing free from the depths of her soul, louder than the storm, sharper than his lies. And in that same heartbeat, the world outside answered her with violence, the sudden eruption of gunfire rattling the windows, shattering the fragile peace, bullets slicing through silence as the walls trembled, and Ilara's scream of love hung in the air, colliding with the deadly chorus of war. The first crack of gunfire split the air like a thunderclap, a savage burst that shattered the fragile moment of silence and sent shards of glass raining across the room as bullets tore through the window panes, embedding themselves into the wooden walls with violent force, each impact shaking the house to its foundations. But before Raphael could react, Ilara's scream ripped through the chaos, and she threw herself in front of him, her small frame colliding with his, as though her body alone could shield him from the storm of lead. The deafening barrage filled her ears, glass and splinters cutting across her arms, the acrid stench of gunpowder thick in her lungs. But she clung to him with a desperation born of love and terror, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken in years as though the heavens might hear her now. Raphael's reflexes ignited like lightning, his powerful arms wrapping around her instantly, his body twisting, dragging her down to the ground with a force that pinned her beneath him, his chest absorbing the rain of glass as he shielded her with everything he had left. His voice was a low growl in her ear, commanding and protective. "Stay down, don't move." But beneath the order trembled something deeper, something she had never heard in him before, fear. Not for himself, but for her. The barrage slowed, then stopped, the echoes of gunfire fading into the roar of the storm outside, leaving only the jagged sound of their breathing and the soft crackle of broken wood settling into silence. And Ilara's trembling hands gripped his jacket, her eyes searching his face with a wild desperation, her voice breaking as she cried out above the ringing in her ears, "Tell me the truth. Do you love me or not?" The words hung heavy in the air, sharper than the bullets that had just torn through the room, striking deeper into Raphael than any wound ever had. And for a moment he tried to hold on to the armor he had built his life upon, tried to smother the weakness clawing at his chest, but her gaze held him captive, those tear-stained eyes stripping him bare, demanding the confession he had sworn he would never make. His jaw tightened, his lips parted, and at last the walls crumbled. He bent closer, his forehead pressed to hers, his voice breaking in a whisper that trembled with truth and danger. "Yes, I love you, but my world will destroy you." The confession scorched the air between them, raw and undeniable, and Ilara's breath caught, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might burst, but instead of recoiling, she reached for him, her fingers trembling as they brushed his cheek, her words firm, despite the tears sliding down her face. "Then let me be destroyed by your side." For a long, soul-shattering moment, the world seemed to stop. The storm, the broken glass, the looming danger. All of it fell away as their lips met in a desperate embrace, sealing their truth in fire and tears, clinging to one another as though their love alone could defy death. But fate was merciless. Before the warmth of the moment could settle, the door exploded inward with a violent crash, boots thundered against the shattered floor, and masked men flooded the room like shadows ripped from nightmares, their weapons raised, their voices shouting commands. And though Raphael roared with fury, his arms tightening around Ilara, it was too late. The attackers swarmed, tearing her from his grasp, her scream piercing the night as she was dragged away into the darkness, her hands clawing for him, her voice breaking on his name while he fought to rise, his own cry of rage swallowed by the chaos as the love he had just confessed was ripped from his arms. The stench of oil and rust clung to the air inside the cavernous warehouse where Ilara was chained, her wrists bound high above her head to a beam that groaned with every shift of her trembling body, her brown skin streaked with blood where the metal had cut too deep. Her hair plastered to her tear-stained face, every breath a ragged whisper of despair as the shadows around her filled with laughter that made her blood run cold. The rival gang circled her like vultures, their boots crunching against broken glass, their voices laced with venom as one leaned close, the sharp edge of his knife grazing her cheek while he hissed, "Your lover can't save you. He's nothing here. He'll die the second he tries." Their words were daggers meant to carve hope out of her chest. But even as fear twisted her stomach, her heart refused to surrender because she knew Raphael, knew the fire in his eyes, knew the rage that lived in his veins, and somewhere beyond the iron walls of this prison, he was coming for her, even if it meant tearing the world apart. And then the night itself split open with thunder, the distant roar of engines cut by the echo of explosions, each blast growing closer, shaking dust from the ceiling and rattling the chains that bound her until the mocking grins on the gangsters' faces faltered, confusion bleeding into fear. And in that moment of hesitation, the world erupted. Doors blasted inward, fire lit the darkness, and there he was, Raphael De Luca, a demon cloaked in smoke and flame, leather jacket torn, rifles clutched in both blood-soaked hands, bombs strapped across his chest, his eyes burning like molten steel, a man not coming to negotiate but to annihilate. The first spray of bullets ripped through the warehouse, his fury unleashed in a storm of lead that cut down men where they stood, their screams drowned by the roar of his rage, the air thick with gunpowder and fire as explosions detonated in the corners, turning shadows into firestorms, bodies hurled against steel like ragdolls, while Raphael advanced step by merciless step, each shot precise, each breath a vow that no one who touched her would live to tell it. Ilara screamed his name, her voice raw and desperate, and his head snapped toward her, his gaze locking onto her like a lifeline, her existence pulling him through the carnage as though the chaos around him were nothing but smoke. He cut through men as if they were paper, his movements a brutal dance of vengeance, rifles emptying into faces, knives flashing when the bullets ran dry, his fists breaking bones, his chest glinting with the promise of death from the explosives strapped against his heart, a warning that he would rather burn with them all than let her be taken. Flames licked higher, smoke choked the air, the floor slick with blood, and as Raphael reached the center of the carnage, silence fell except for the crackle of fire and the dripping of blood, his figure carved from hellfire itself as he strode toward her chains, his hand outstretched, his lips parting to whisper her name like a prayer of salvation. But before his fingers could touch her, the metallic click of a gun hammer shattered the fragile pores, and cold steel pressed against Ilara's temple. She froze, her breath caught, her wide eyes flicking sideways to the rival boss who had emerged from the smoke, his suit unsullied, his sneer carved with malice as he dug the barrel deeper against her skin. Raphael's body locked, every muscle coiled like a beast ready to kill, his finger twitching on the trigger, but the boss's voice cut through the haze like poison. "Choose," he snarled, his grin cruel, his eyes glittering with triumph. "Her life, or yours." The warehouse burned around them, smoke curling through shattered beams and flames clawing at the night sky. But all Raphael could see was the cold barrel pressed against Ilara's temple, the rival boss's sneer daring him to take a step closer. His chest heaved with fury, his finger hovered on the trigger of his rifle, yet he knew one twitch could end her life, and the thought hollowed him out until only one choice remained. Slowly, with eyes locked on hers, he lowered his weapon, the heavy rifles clattering against the blood-stained floor, his voice rough, raw, stripped of pride as he growled, "Take me, let her go." For a heartbeat the world held still, Ilara's wide eyes brimming with tears at the sacrifice in his words. But the rival boss only laughed, the cruel sound echoing like steel, mocking the nobility of a man who had built his life on violence. and without hesitation, he yanked the trigger, the deafening crack splitting the air. In that frozen instant, Raphael's heart stopped, his body moving too late. But Ilara, driven by a force greater than fear, wrenched her body sideways, shoving the gun at the last second, and the bullet tore through her arm with a sickening spray of blood instead of her skull. Her scream ripped through the firestorm, high and broken, and Raphael's world exploded. Rage detonated inside him, raw and unstoppable, his roar shaking the rafters as adrenaline surged, snapping the restraints of reason and unleashing the beast buried beneath his flesh. With a surge of inhuman strength, he tore free of the men who tried to hold him back, the chains that bound his soul and body shattering beneath his fury, links snapping like brittle bones as his blood-slicked fists flew with merciless precision. He lunged forward, his hands seizing the rival boss by the throat, the weight of vengeance in every tremor of his muscles, as he slammed him against the burning wall, squeezing until bones cracked under his grip, his eyes blazing with murder as the man clawed helplessly at his iron hands. The rival boss's scream gurgled into silence as Raphael twisted, breaking the spine with one savage motion, the lifeless body collapsing to the blood-soaked floor while the remaining gangsters scattered, terrified of the devil that now walked among the flames. Raphael stood heaving, his chest drenched in sweat and soot, his knuckles dripping with the blood of the man who dared touch her. But the triumph meant nothing, because behind him Ilara slumped against the beam, her skin pale, her arm bleeding in torrents, her breath shallow gasps that rattled in the smoke. In an instant, his fury dissolved into desperation, and he rushed to her side, gathering her fragile body into his arms, whispering broken pleas against her hair as tears carved through the soot on his face. "Stay with me, Ilara. Don't you dare leave me now," he begged, pressing his jacket against her wound, lifting her as though she weighed nothing, carrying her through the inferno while the warehouse collapsed behind them, beams crashing, fire snapping at their heels, smoke choking the night until they burst into the open air. The storm had broken, rain pouring in heavy sheets that hissed against the fire, soaking them both as Raphael stumbled across the mud, his legs trembling under the weight of exhaustion and grief. But he held her tighter, his lips pressed to her temple, promising her survival with every step, even as his vision blurred with rage and sorrow. He fell to his knees in the wet grass beyond the burning ruin, his body broken, blood streaming from his own wounds. But none of it mattered because she was still breathing, her face tilted weakly toward his, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the power of a vow as her trembling lips brushed his ear. "Marry me before I die." The rain fell in relentless sheets as Raphael staggered through the deserted streets. Ilara cradled against his chest, her blood soaking into his skin like molten fire, each shallow breath she drew slicing deeper into his soul. And though his body screamed with exhaustion, his legs carried him like a man possessed, every stride driven by the terror that she might close her eyes and never open them again. Then, through the haze of storm and smoke, a flicker of light appeared. A chapel, its doors half-rotted, its bell tower looming like a skeleton against the stormy sky. And without hesitation, he crashed through the doors, his boots pounding against the stone floor, the smell of incense and wax mixing with the metallic tang of blood. Inside, a frail priest turned in shock, clutching his rosary, but Raphael's gun was at his chest in an instant, the barrel pressed hard enough to make the man tremble as Raphael's voice thundered, broken with desperation. "Marry us! Now." Before she slips away, the priest stammered, his eyes darting to the half-conscious woman in Raphael's arms, her head lolling against his shoulder, blood dripping from her fingers, and though fear kept him frozen, the unrelenting fire in Raphael's eyes forced his obedience. Candles flickered as the storm howled beyond the stained glass, casting their figures in trembling shadows, while Raphael laid Ilara gently upon the altar steps, his hands shaking as he brushed her damp hair from her face, whispering her name like a lifeline, her lips parting in weak protest until he silenced her with a desperate kiss, promising silently that she would not leave this world without belonging to him. The priest, voice quivering, opened his battered book and began the rites, his words trembling against the roar of the storm, and as he spoke, Raphael grasped Ilara's hand, pressing her blood-streaked palm against his chest, their mingled wounds staining the pages red, as though their vows were written not in ink, but in the currency of pain and survival. Her eyes fluttered open, glazed with tears, her voice no louder than a breath as she whispered her vows, each syllable breaking his heart with the fragility of her strength. And Raphael, unable to contain the tidal wave inside him, bent close, his forehead against hers, declaring his love not as a vow of hope, but as a defiance of death itself. The candles guttered, dripping wax like tears as the priest's voice rose, steadying against the storm, declaring them husband and wife, and in that moment Ilara's tears spilled freely, tears of joy for the bond she had longed for, tears of pain for the wounds that might claim her, tears of eternal love for the man who had carved her heart out of fire and ruin. Raphael kissed her then, fiercely, desperately, as though the world might shatter if he let her go, the taste of blood and rain and tears mingling in a kiss that bound them more tightly than any chain, and when he pulled back her lips, still trembled with a smile, a fragile flicker of peace in the chaos, the storm outside breaking into silence as if the heavens themselves had witnessed their union. But fate was merciless, and time was cruel, for the night dissolved into days into months, and the world spun forward on broken wheels until 9 months later the scene shifted to a hospital room dimly lit by sterile lamps, where Ilara, her skin glistening with sweat, lay upon a bed cradling a newborn son in her trembling arms. Her face, though pale with exhaustion, glowed with the softest light of fulfillment, her lips pressing to the child's dark curls as she whispered the name she had chosen, the name of the father who had carved himself into her soul. But as she lifted her gaze around the empty room, the joy in her eyes faltered, because Raphael was nowhere to be found. The first pale light of dawn crept across the horizon, brushing the world in fragile gold as the hospital ward lay hushed in the stillness of a new morning, the air heavy with antiseptic and the faint murmur of life just beginning. And it was then, when silence held its breath, that Raphael appeared in the doorway, not with blood on his hands or weapons slung across his shoulders, but with a simple bouquet of crushed wildflowers clutched awkwardly in his fists, their petals trembling as though they too feared to be rejected by the woman who had risked everything for him. His black leather jacket was gone, replaced by a plain shirt that clung damply to his frame, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights, yet softened by a quiet reverence as he approached the bed where Ilara lay pale but alive, her newborn pressed against her chest, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet glowing with a love that banished every shadow. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, until he stood at her side, and for the first time in his life, the man who had once commanded armies of killers lowered himself to his knees, bowing not to power or fear, but to love. And he took her hand with a tenderness that made her breath hitch, pressing his lips against her skin as though sealing a vow older than words. His voice breaking into the hush of morning as he whispered, "I have buried the Mafia boss tonight. From now on, I'm only your husband and his father." Ilara's tears welled, shimmering trails down her cheeks as her gaze flickered from Raphael to the fragile infant in her arms, and she whispered the name she had chosen, a name carved from her past, from the father she had lost, a gift of memory that would ensure her child carried not just blood, but legacy. And in that naming, she stitched back a fragment of the family stolen from her. Raphael bent closer, his large hands trembling as he cradled the tiny bundle, the warmth of his son seeping through his calloused palms. his chest constricting with emotions too vast to contain, a love so fierce it terrified him, because he knew he could fight men, outrun bullets, conquer empires. But this fragile, perfect life was a battle he could never win with violence, only with the strength to change. For a fleeting heartbeat, the three of them were a portrait of peace. Ilara watching with quiet devotion, Raphael rocking the child gently, the storm outside their lives seemingly dissolved into a dawn of new beginnings, the mafia boss exorcised, the husband and father born. But as Raphael pressed a kiss to his son's forehead, his eyes closed against the weight of hope and fear entwined. A single tear slipped free, carving a path down his scarred cheek, because he knew that no matter how deep he buried the monster he once was, the past was carved into his skin and soul, and ghosts were not so easily laid to rest. The world outside would never forget Raphael De Luca, and though he cradled his family in trembling arms, a shadow lingered over his heart, whispering that this fragile peace was only borrowed time. And then, as if the universe itself conspired to confirm his dread, the camera of fate shifted beyond the hospital window into the misty garden where the dawn light stretched thin, and there, half hidden behind the curtain of rain, a solitary figure stood watching, his silhouette long and sharp against the glass, the glow of a cigarette ember flaring as his lips curled into a whisper meant only for himself, yet heavy enough to shatter futures. "Enjoy your peace, Raphael. It won't last long."